it's long been recognised that we have the right to freedom of thought, but it's been overlooked in application and practice. It's not been clear how we can protect freedom of thought, given that it's not possible, one would think, to really interfere with that right, given our idea that our thoughts are safe within our own minds. But of course, there is now a renaissance with the right, given that neurotechnology certainly at least challenges those assumptions. Neurotechnologies can be defined as a device that directly decodes or can change brain activity. And that's quite broad. It can include devices that have been directly implanted into the brain, or it can include devices that, for example, sit on top of the skin of the head. And we have seen that a lot of these technologies have been developed for very good, very legitimate medical research reasons, often to mitigate the disastrous consequences of brain injuries or cognitive diseases. But when they go from the laboratory into what is happening, the consumer market, we're seeing lots of different issues, mostly around the fact that it's currently a largely unregulated area. Unregulated at the point of design, unregulated at the point of going into the market, often with very powerful capacity to decode, to change that brain activity, but not under the same regulatory demands that such technologies would be in the medical context. So for human rights, we have, of course, concerns around mental privacy, of course, concerns around data protection. How is that data being used when it's being recorded? Who by? Who's overseeing it? And of course, the right to freedom of thought. And so the right to freedom of thought is particularly relevant here because it's an absolute right. So that means under no circumstances, with no justification, with no exceptions, can the right be violated. And it means at least three things, the right to freedom of thought. It means that someone can't be punished for what they think. It means that what they think can't be impermissibly altered. And it also means that the contents of someone's thoughts can't be revealed without their consent. So we can see how those three aspects of the right could now be relevant in the context of neurotechnology. I see neurotechnology as a continuation of a history of attempts to understand what is inside the human mind, sometimes punish what is assumed or known to be inside the human mind, or to change and treat what is inside the human mind. So that could be even therapeutic interventions, it could be conversion therapy, but of course it includes very abusive and very coercive attempts to alter what's inside the mind. So there is a continuation there, but what's different about neurotechnologies is that the intervention is direct. There's the capacity to directly interact with the brain through feedback, and there's a capacity to decode almost in real time the contents of the brain. And of course, the contents of the brain is hugely individual, very subjective, changeable. It's not fixed. And so I consider that neurotechnology isn't so much a new threat or a new challenge for human rights protections. It maps on to all of the existing systematic challenges that human rights face: inequality, discrimination, poverty, abuse of power and powerlessness, coercion, exploitation. all of these things will be present, if not amplified, in some contexts through the use of neurotechnology. So we really need to think in a joined up way how to provide international protections for individuals, for the human mind in this context, and we need to do it quickly. Why would someone require someone else to wear some kind of neurotechnology? And if someone does it voluntarily, what's been done with that data? Who owns it? How can the individual access it? How can they delete it? What are the circumstances in which that information can be used or sold by other people? I mean, my real concern around this is that there's a commodification of our minds. Yeah. It's set to make companies millions of pounds, of dollars, and that's our own, the most intimate space. It's considered to be inviolable core of the human being, the mind. And yet we're currently designing ways to penetrate that. And there's nothing wrong per se with trying to engage with the content of someone's mind, their thoughts. We do that all the time. That's how we develop meaningful connections with other people. But it's the context in which that's being done and for what purpose. Yeah. And with what oversight and with what accountability mechanisms when the inevitable happens, which is abuse of power. That is inevitable, particularly without proper regulations, particularly without clear international standards, and particularly without recourse to justice when people have been, their rights have been violated. And we don't know the consequence of what that will be for individuals yet. But it could be, I expect and imagine it could be incredibly profound, incredibly damaging. It depends on why someone has a neurotechnology. It depends on the underlying business model of that particular device. For example, is the underlying business model data collection, data analysis, and therefore selling data? Or is the underlying business model something different? But really the rights that are engaged include, of course, the right to privacy, the right to freedom of thought, which I mentioned, is absolute, and under no circumstances, with no justification, with no conditions, can the right be violated. But there are also really broad issues, broad concepts, broad liberties that are being engaged here. Dignity, human autonomy. Don't forget that some of the devices, some of the technology, some of the scientific papers are reporting the ability to interfere with the human mind, interfere with what we would perhaps think to be spontaneous, autonomous thoughts, thought processes, mental states, but are actually being influenced externally and without our knowledge. That's a complete violation, a complete erasure of our individual autonomy and of our dignity. So we have to be careful because we're potentially sleepwalking into a scenario where there's widespread and very rapid use of these technologies in various different scenarios. Of course, the military, employment, healthcare, education, and of course, just well-being, consumerism. And that could roll out very quickly without any safety net, without any regulations, without any limits, without oversight, without transparency, without the capacity for people to control it themselves. And that, of course, would be incredibly problematic because you open up as well the potential for abuse. When we reduce people to units of productivity. In the workplace, one of the justifications is well-being, productivity, and safety. You're reducing individuals to objects for a wider purpose, usually economic activity. So we're objectifying ourselves, we're objectifying the human mind, we're erasing a sphere of ourselves that is so profoundly unique and requires such care, such respect. It's not open for such intrusion. And I can't think of any justification outside of medical necessity that the law should permit, given how intrusive it is and given how many rights, let alone the absolute right to freedom of thought, how many other rights are engaged by it. I wouldn't advocate for employers being able to track brain data, given how invasive it is and given the inherent and very significant power imbalance between employer and employee in terms of economic power imbalance and in terms of just the employment relationship. I don't consider that there are any justifications for such an invasive practice in that context. Even safety. Almost all objectives that an employer might rely on to justify asking employers or requiring employees to wear neurotechnology can be met by better working terms and conditions, whether that's well-being, whether that's productivity, even safety. Better terms and conditions would meet all of those things. So it would just be a wholesale intrusion into individuals' mental space. We don't know what the limits of that would be. And it's a coercive relationship. So there's an element of coercion given that imbalance, that power imbalance. And it's not good enough to say, well, people can walk away, they can get another job. That's not an option. That is not the get out that we have here. Is it a proportionate measure given what the objective is? If the objective is to help workers improve their attention span, is tracking their brain data a proportionate way of doing that? I would say not. And I would say there are many, many other ways that would benefit everyone in a much more wholesome way that could meet that objective. We know that a lot of these multinational global corporations have a vested interest in this technology because they have invested huge sums of money. So they see a profit. They see a return on that investment. And what's the source of the profit? Us. Our thoughts, our mental activity, the way we think, what we think about, the way our brain works, that's what's being commodified. And so what are the risks then? There are tons of risks and many risks that we can't foresee. When smartphones were developed and the internet and then, of course, specific content platforms, they were developed in tandem at different points and they all united. And the children and teenagers of this and the previous generation have been the guinea pigs. And they've suffered. And not only will they suffer, generations to come will suffer, and that will be incredibly influential, and the margin is enormous. Yeah. There are thousands of children who are experiencing real harm as a consequence, and we sleptwalked into it.
From Instagram or,
from
media they can access now without any restriction.
Yeah. So it's several points, isn't it? It's the level of addiction and how the brain development is being influenced and how that actually isn't advantageous. It's also the actual information and the content itself. We know, for example, of contagion around eating disorders that are happening, radicalisation, violent misogyny. These are real things that people absorb into themselves and then conduct themselves accordingly to that ideology or that viewpoint of the world or of themselves that they have ingested. So that is all fueled by data, by that data economy, that rapid, exploitative, very fast-paced data brokering that's happening all the time. And data as the underlying business model for neurotechnologies will be a different form potentially, but again, much closer to our minds. Another thing that comes up with neurotechnologies is, when people think of privacy in this context, they might think privacy in terms of not having to say or reveal what you think. But actually, privacy also means space. Having space, having a sphere of space that you can control, where within that space, within that sphere, you can think the way you want to think. We all have to go through thinking processes in order to arrive at something more enlightened, more rational, more balanced. And we need that space. We need the privacy that gives us that space. And we also all alter our behaviour and our thinking when we believe we're being observed, when we're being watched. Yeah. And that is also incredibly problematic because that will then be internalised again. We internalise that sense of being watched when we know we're being physically observed by someone, and we might adjust our movements. But if that surveillance is within our minds, you are then altering something that's so natural, so essential, our cognitive functioning. We're altering it because we're conscious of being observed, being judged, being manipulated, having that information used against us without us knowing, without us being able to stop that. So people need to have control, not just feel that they have control, but really, really do actually have ultimate control. Some people use the term sovereignty. Sovereignty over our mind. Generally, I wouldn't advocate for neurotechnologies, except for medical necessity. Yeah. And I would certainly not advocate for the wholesale adoption of neurotechnologies to address issues, to enhance well-being, when there are other ways of doing so, and when the payout is so big. Yeah. And when we don't know the consequence of it, when we don't know exactly how to uphold our rights. Upholding your right to freedom of thought would have to go through the courts at the moment because it's a completely neglected right. It's not been fleshed out by the courts. So it's not like you could go to a tribunal. It's not like there would be a mechanism to write to the company. You'd probably have a better way of going through the data protection authorities, but that's also an incredibly slow process. It's not clear that you can just turn off the device and delete the data from the cloud. And in fact, there have been some legal proceedings against at least one neurotechnology company in Chile. And this was brain data that was stored on the cloud that an individual couldn't access or delete. And the Constitutional Court held that it was a violation of data protection rights and that therefore it was unconstitutional. So we do have some precedents for courts considering these types of devices, but we've also seen that without clear regulations, people exploit it. Authorities in India, for example, began to use various different neurotechnologies against suspects. Yeah, brain, electrical oscillation, and brain fingerprinting. And these technology were being deployed when investigating crimes and then being relied on to secure a conviction. And many years later, it did go to the Indian Supreme Court, who held that it, violated individual dignity and was a breach of substantive due process rights. But that just goes to show that without being proactive, without putting the limits in place, without protecting people's rights prior to their abuse, wholesale potentially, there will be an exploitation. Yeah. Human rights bodies have a responsibility to protect rights. And where there's a risk, they should be proactive in setting out standards, international standards, potentially treaties, certainly guidelines on how to protect human rights in a new context, as would be the case here. I would urge them not to isolate neurotechnology apart from any other pattern of human rights abuse. You put neurotechnology in a totalitarian state or an oppressive regime, or you put neurotechnology in a hyper-consumerist marketplace. The same pattern of abuse of individual rights occurs with the same threads of inequality, powerlessness and abuse of power, discrimination and so forth, exploitation, deception, coercion. The pattern is there. We know what can happen. And I would urge them to hurry up. I would urge them to get on with it. And I would urge international bodies to consult with human rights lawyers. There's a whole myriad of experts who have something to contribute. Neuroscientists, data protection experts, psychologists, child experts, child development experts, but also human rights lawyers, because we need to be clear on what the standards are. And those standards need to align with accepted and present concepts and standards already present in international human rights law. So the right to freedom of thought isn't a new concept. It exists, it's established, it just needs to be fleshed out, and we just need clarity on how it would apply in this context of neurotechnology. So myself and my colleague, Patrick O'Callaghan, have just co-edited the first survey on how the right to freedom of thought is protected internationally. So we looked at 18 different jurisdictions where contributors from those different jurisdictions wrote on where the right is protected, what status it has, how is it protected in law, how is it interpreted, how has it been applied, and what are the social, economic, political, historical, legal factors that influence how the right is interpreted and how the right is applied. So this revealed actually so much new information that we just didn't have before. There was an assumption of, well, it will probably just be the case that lots of countries have enshrined the right by incorporating the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, for example, but that it's gone no further. It's sunk no more deeply into the legal system. or into the human rights culture within that country. And that's actually not the case. So freedom of thought actually does have capacity to apply here. There are courts who have really considered how it would apply in some of these contexts. So there's precedence there. And so international bodies, other courts in other jurisdictions can take inspiration from that. They can use that to develop and further enrich and give more substance to the right in other jurisdictions or in other international treaties. So the book actually was really fascinating in that way. And it also covers some conceptual, some philosophical, some political debates and challenges around the rights application, including neurotechnology.